Welcome back. This is part 2 of our lectures for week 7. I will be discussing the content for the week, which relates to our readings from last week on response to intervention, as well as previewing readings for this week, which are focused on using assessment data to inform instruction. So there are two objectives. First, to apply the guiding principles of response to intervention to create an environment and structure where all students achieve. So going back to the week 6 readings. And then second, to use data to make instructional decisions, which goes with our week 7 readings. So this past week, you should have read on the RTI network the example of the framework and then the IRA position statement. Both of those were pretty foundational readings to just explain, the basics of response to intervention. And then you had two articles to choose from, the first on assessment in RTI, and then the second pertaining to content area teachers. So I'm going to talk briefly about RTI related to these articles, as well as providing my own insights in implementing RTI. So a brief background of RTI. So before, students were determined to have learning difficulties based on an ability achievement discrepancy model. So the solution was to problem solve by referring the student to special education. So that was before the IDEA Act. Now, with No Child Left Behind and the Reauthorization of Individuals with Disabilities Education Improvement Act, so IDEA, the determination of learning difficulties is now made by seeing how students respond to scientific research-based intervention. So we are actually using a problem-solving process to analyze the match between instruction and the student's needs. So is the student responding to your instruction? If not, then perhaps you should provide an intervention that is catered more to the student's need, like a tier 2 intervention. And if they do not respond to that, maybe you will need to increase in the intensity or the frequency or the duration and provide a tier 3 intervention. So foundational beliefs of RTI are that all children can learn. It is our responsibility to identify the instructional and environmental conditions that enable learning. So if your tier 1 instruction is not effective for all learners, it is your job to problem solve how you can reach those learners it is not effective for in a new and different way. That is why the formative assessment process is so critical to response to intervention, because through the formative assessment process you can see if your instruction is as effective as it needs to be. Another foundational belief is that early intervention is key to addressing concerns as they arise before problems grow. So we are not waiting for failure with RTI, we are intervening before students are starting to fail. So the language from the IRA position statement is thus: language related to response to intervention was written into U.S. law with the 2004 reauthorization of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. This law indicates that school districts are no longer required to take into consideration whether a severe discrepancy exists between a student's achievement and his or her intellectual ability in determining eligibility for learning disability services. So if you're in special education and you remember before, a school psychologist would do some IQ testing, and then we would see if the IQ is reflected in their school performance. If not, then they must be special education. However, now, rather, they must use an alternative approach that determines first whether the student responds to scientific, research-based classroom instruction, and if not, then to more intensive and targeted interventions. After receiving this more tailored and intensive instruction, students who do not demonstrate adequate progress are then considered for evaluation for a specific learning disability. This approach has come to be known as RTI, although this precise term is not used in the law. So we are providing high quality instruction. If it is not effective, we are determining how we can be effective, providing interventions as such, documenting those interventions, documenting progress or lack of progress, and then moving on from there. So RTI is a general education-led effort. However, 15% of special education funds can be used for RTI, so that's why it's often confused and thought that it is a special education effort. It is a model of prevention. RTI is not special education placement or a special education led effort, and it is not a model of failure. We are not waiting for them to fail before we enact response to intervention. RTI is a problem-solving process that focuses on effective instruction. It is not a system for identifying what is wrong with the student. It is not a specific program or model. In fact, the federal government purposely provided few details. You can have 3 tiers, you can have more than 3 tiers. There isn't a specific program or model. So that's a little bit about what it is and what it is not. A little bit more about RTI. It is a systematic, data-driven approach to instruction that benefits every student, and that is from the California Department of Education. So within intervention, you can provide interventions for academics and or behavior. So I'm going to speak primarily about RTI for literacy, language arts, but you could also do RTI and have a structure and framework in place for math instruction as well as for behavior interventions. So again, the goal is prevention, to prevent academic and behavioral difficulties with early identification, followed by immediate intervention. So there are essential components to RTI. The first being high quality, research-based classroom instruction. So that is your tier 1 instruction. It must be high quality. Next is universal screening. So you need some universal measure of assessment given to all students. And from there you can determine who is in need of some intervention and what type or level of intervention to provide. At that time, you will provide research-based interventions. You may need to administer some deeper assessments like diagnostic assessments in order to determine the best interventions for your students. Keep in mind that in order to start RTI, once you give an assessment or want to give an assessment to a student that is not being given to all students in that grade, you do need parent permission. You also need parent permission or notification to start interventions. So I have a letter if you ever need requesting parent permission to administer diagnostic assessments as well as to start interventions. All right, so then you give research-based interventions during which you need to continuously progress monitor their effectiveness and collect the data, manage the data, and communicate the data. And in a few minutes, I will show you a data plan that I've used for RTI. You also need to hold staff development on RTI and collaborate with general education teachers. Lastly, you need to involve parents. I often do an RTI open house at the beginning of the year to communicate with parents about the RTI program. I'm also available twice during the year when I hold parent conferences for RTI students. All right, so RTI is often based on a 3-tier model, but it does not have to be 3 tiers. It could be 2 or 4 or 5, whatever your heart desires. So at tier 1, that consists of all students with the core classroom instruction. I actually took this from the Center for Research on the Educational Achievement and Teaching of English Language Learners. I went to a RTI session by Echeverria and Voigt from Cal State Long Beach, who are amazing and big names in RTI and English language learners. If you ever have a chance to do PD with them, you should definitely do that. But their PD was focused on SIOP, so you'll see SIOP on here, which is just sheltered instruction or strategies for providing effective instruction for English language learners. So this 3-tier model kind of incorporates English language learners there, whereas the next one I'll show you has special education with it. All right, so tier 1 consists of all students. Now tier 1 instruction, although we're hoping it's effective, is not going to be effective for everyone. So at the tier 2 level, you may have 20 to 30% of your student population who need a strategic intervention here. And then even beyond that, maybe 5 to 10% need a more intensive intervention. Now, it is not feasible for you to have interventions for 80% of your student population. If 80% are in need of intervention, something is not happening in your core classroom instruction. So as you move up the tiers, you also increase with time, data, and intensity. So you increase the amount of time you're spending, you increase data collection and the intensity of your intervention. And I'll show you more about what happens in each of the tiers in a minute. Here's that RTI model, including special education, right? So here we have our Tier 1 Foundation Standards Aligned Instruction for all students. Tier 2 has some supplemental interventions for students at some risk, and then Tier 3 is for students that are high risk. So over here you have an increase of time, intensity, and data, and over here you have a decrease of the percentage of students requiring intensive supports. Now, 10 to 20% of your special education is probably here, whereas 80 to 90% of the special education population is there. All right, like I was telling you, here is an overview of tiers 1, 2, and 3. So tier 1, the goal is to prevent failure and optimize learning throughout whole class scientifically based instruction. Tier 2, the goal is to provide more intensive support to students who are falling behind. Tier 3 is to provide highly focused, research-based, individualized instruction to students who still have considerable difficulty meeting grade level expectations. Who is at Tier 1, all students. Tier 2, students identified with reading difficulties who have not responded to the Tier 1 interventions. Tier 3 is students with marked difficulties in reading who have not responded to either Tier 1 or Tier 2. The interventionist at Tier 1 is the classroom teacher. The interventionist at Tier 2 can also be the classroom teacher or the literacy specialist or resource specialist. Tier 3, same thing. The setting of Tier 1 is the general education classroom. Tier 2 can be push in and or pull out. Same with Tier 3. Grouping in Tier 1 is flexible grouping. For Tier 2, it's homogeneous small group instruction, about 4 to 5 students, whereas in Tier 3 we have only 2 to 3 students. So that increases the intensity of the intervention when you are decreasing the number of students in the group. The time for Tier 1 should be a minimum of 90 minutes per day for your literacy block. For Tier 2, we want to add 30 minutes a day, 4 days a week, in addition to Tier 1. So we cannot pull out during this core instruction. The intervention needs to happen at a different time. Now we increase the time for Tier 3 to perhaps 45 minutes a day, in addition to the Tier 1 instruction. Assessment at the Tier 1 level consists of benchmark assessments for the beginning, middle, and end of year. Progress monitoring should occur in Tier 2 twice a month or every other week, whereas here progress monitoring at Tier 3 perhaps occurs on a weekly basis. Back to that IRA position statement. So they identified 6 key topics or guiding principles for RTI. The first one being instruction, and with that, instruction that is intended to prevent problems by optimizing language and literacy instruction. So we want optimal instruction and assessment conducted by the classroom teacher. That is central to the success of RTI. We need very high quality instruction based on research-based practices. Second is responsive teaching and differentiation. This means that instruction is differentiated based on relevant assessment data. So this is where you do need to use your assessment data to plan interventions for specific student need. Assessment should reflect the multidimensional nature of language and literacy. It should also provide useful and timely information about desired language. And these ideas are echoed in that article for this week, making the most of assessments to inform instruction. There should also be a layered approach in which screening techniques are used to identify students and then for ongoing diagnostic assessment data. Collaboration is key in a response to intervention framework. Collaboration should increase, not reduce, the coherence of the instruction experienced by struggling readers. And this is something we're currently working through at my school site, It is very difficult for a student to attend their Tier 1 instruction where the classroom instructor is very focused on a certain approach and a certain goal, and then to be pulled out and have a different goal and a different approach. So the more the general education teacher and the interventionist can work in concert with each other, the better for the student's success. This will take some increased communication and coordinated planning. Next component would be systemic and comprehensive approaches. So RTI needs to be integrated within the context of a coherent and consistent literacy curriculum. It must be appropriate for the particular school or district culture and have collaboration amongst many professionals. Administrators must be supportive and provide resources and add appropriate scheduling, and there should be professional development as well. And then lastly, teacher expertise is really central to instructional improvement, and we've already talked about that at length through other articles in this course. So again, the 2004 IDEA Act authorizes RTI states that assessment should include data-based documentation of repeated assessments of achievement at reasonable intervals. So we really must be focused on the data and documenting how we're using that data. Contrary to popular belief, the law and regulations do not mandate universal screening, nor do they specify which assessments should be used or how frequently they should be given. The intent, as we, the authors, read it, is to use assessment information as the basis for differentiating instruction so it is more responsive to students' needs and more likely to accelerate students' learning. So no, you do not have to use DIBELS. You can use whatever you want, but the intent is to really use that assessment data to differentiate instruction. So find a tool that is very useful to you in that purpose. All right, assessment in RTI, what teachers and specialists need to know. So this article provided a review of the multiple purposes for assessment. So first you have a screening measure, which helps you to identify who is in need of intervention. And this universal screening would be given to all of your student population. Next, you have diagnostic assessments. This could include running records, spelling inventories, oral language assessments, many of the tools you learned about in 516. And the purpose is to increase the depth at which you're looking of student need. Next, we have formative progress monitoring. This can include teacher-made assessments, book logs, work samples, anecdotal records, standardized or semi-structured measures of student performance, such as miscue analysis or observational notes from reading and writing conferences. We also have benchmark progress monitoring, which refers to data that's gathered at predetermined times of the year to ascertain if students are making adequate progress in relation to age or grade expectations. And then lastly, we have summative outcome assessments, which are usually gathered at the end of the year to determine the effectiveness of instruction. So here is a sample of assessment data that I used and collected when I was working as the literacy specialist. So first, with universal screening, we did DIBELS for our whole student population 3 times a year. I'm not advocating DIBELS. I'm mainly telling you what we did at one point, but we actually saw some limitations in doing that. So that is one approach though. For diagnostic assessments, these were used to assist in selecting interventions. So they were administered by the literacy specialist, and I used the core multiple measures for assessment as well as an informal reading inventory. Performative progress monitoring, that includes classroom-based measures done by the classroom teacher. For benchmark progress monitoring, the literacy and resource specialist conducted running records and informal reading inventories as well. And then summative assessments, we looked at our school-wide benchmark assessments and our CST results to see if the outcomes we wanted were reached. Here is a sample RTI implementation timeline that I found that kind of gives you an idea of how to set up your assessment timelines. So in September, we administered the DIBELS and then also the developmental reading assessment, which is an informal reading inventory, and all teachers actually gave the DRA to their own students, and they were required to submit their data by September 25th so that I could analyze the results. Then in October, we started the Tier 2 interventions based off of the data from September, and we also started progress monitoring. Teachers then had to submit their monthly reading data by October 30th, so they gave another reading assessment and had to submit the data. In November, I held data reflection meetings with each classroom teacher to go over the formative progress monitoring data that they submitted. We continued the interventions, we continued progress monitoring, and then again at the end of the month, they had to submit monthly reading data. So you can see the pattern here. Then the first week of December, I held data reflection meetings, and then we administered our mid-year kind of benchmarking tool, which was DIBELS and DRA, and then I wanted to get feedback from them on RTI. So that was how I set this up. Again, there is no prescribed way to do this. There are many ways to do this. You definitely need a plan though. You need a plan for how you will collect your data, how you will manage your data, and how you will communicate your data. So I actually put my sample data plan in the resources section of Titanium to give you some ideas. But basically, like I mentioned, you have your data collection. So 3 times a year we're doing our, universal screening. These are our benchmarks, blah, blah, blah. Then the management of the data, who's going to do that? Each teacher had a reading recorder, an Excel spreadsheet that they would submit to me, and then I would compile the results of everybody's reading recorder into a master intervention spreadsheet that is organized by teacher. It includes all students, their reading scores, their placement and intervention. There's a summary sheet. So how are you going to manage all of the data? And then communicating data. So each month, teachers are going to email me their reading recorder. I'm going to update the intervention spreadsheet and send out a summary of the school's progress. The email will include the percentage of students making growth in each class, as well as how many students are reading on grade level. Then the intervention team is going to go student by student to discuss data and make decisions about intervention. Who will Tier 1 targets be, who needs to be pulled into intervention, moved out, etc. The week after data is submitted, we'll meet with each teacher to discuss their data and changes to intervention. We also had a student data wall in the Learning Center showing where each student is performing. Each time an intervention student is progress monitored, a small sheet summarizing their progress is sent home. Parents will also receive a formal intervention report during conferences held with interventionists. So as you can see, there's a lot to do with the data, and you really need to have a concrete plan for how you're going to incorporate all of those pieces. All right, the second choice article was on what RTI means for content area teachers. And it says that while it is clear that content area teachers cannot be expected to teach struggling readers basic reading skills, they can help students develop the knowledge, reading strategies, and thinking skills to understand and learn from increasingly complex texts in their content areas. So as the article talks about, you read with a different lens depending on the content area you're reading in. So science teachers need to teach students how to read with that scientific lens. What RTI means for content area teachers, these authors state that RTI in secondary schools has 3 purposes. 1, to build capacity to meet graduation standards, right? In order to graduate, you should be a proficient reader. 2, to ensure appropriate instruction and intervention. And 3, to provide a system of continuous school improvement. None of these goals can be met without a change in the way literacy is taught in content area classrooms. According to Brozo, if content teachers fail to offer responsive literacy instruction to benefit every student and differentiated assistance for those in need of extra help, then the preventative potential of RTI is lost. So although you are a content area teacher and your goal is to teach your content area, you still need to differentiate the delivery of that content so that it is accessible to all students. So what does Tier 1 look like at the secondary level? According to Langer, subject area teachers who are disciplinary experts need to guide, model, and provide opportunities for students to try out and step into the ways of thinking that are appropriate to that discipline. As teachers invite students to become learners in academic disciplines, they need to provide discipline-specific strategy instruction, increased opportunities to read, differentiated reading materials, and literacy assessment. So very similar to some of the key points of articles we've read previously in this class. We need to increase the opportunities that they're reading. We need to teach them specific strategies and use assessments. Researchers began identifying how literacy is used in the disciplines. Lee and Spratley suggested that there are several reading and thinking strategies that are used across the disciplines, such as building prior knowledge, building specialized vocabulary, learning to deconstruct complex sentences, using knowledge of text structures and genres, mapping a graphic and mathematical representations, posing discipline-relevant questions, comparing claims and propositions across text, and evaluating claims. So those are skills and strategies with thinking that can apply to all areas. So you as a school can unify with some of these things regardless of your content area you teach. So how do I differentiate? They provided several ideas for selecting text for students to read. So you can use challenging text with associated explanations. You can use text at the zone of their proximal development. You can use easy text to build self-efficacy or a balanced diet of text at varying difficulty, and text tailored to develop particular reading components. So if you see page 232 of that article, no, if you see page 279 of that article, it will tell you more about differentiation of the reading materials. So what does Tier 2 look like? So Tier 2 intervention frameworks used in secondary schools, there are 3 different types. First, you can use a purchase program. Second, you can use instruction that addresses individual reading needs. Well, how are you going to do that? First, you need to figure out what those needs are. And then third, you can provide strategy instruction. So some schools have instituted general reading classes for all students who enter high school with low reading scores. There are several problems with this approach. These reading classes are often focused on general reading strategies and vocabulary development. However, placing students with different reading needs in the same intervention has little chance of improving their achievement and may even make literacy problems worse. So again, because they're a poor reader, we can't just assume that they need help with these things. We need to conduct those diagnostic assessments, see what they need, develop a tiered approach, and give them instruction to match their needs. So here's a different approach, strategy instruction. Research on strategy instruction is robust. There is strong evidence that teaching students specific vocabulary and comprehension strategies produces achievement. In a synthesis of intervention studies conducted between 1994 and 2004 with students in grades 6 through 12, researchers found very strong evidence for comprehension and strategy instruction. However, if intervention classes are focused on strategy instruction, Conley argued that strategy instruction in isolation without a direct application to specific disciplines will not meet students' needs, and I definitely agree with that. All right, so putting it all together, a lot of information about RTI. Hopefully you feel like you have a better understanding of the key components. When I was charged with having to start an RTI program, I attended that great PD I told you about, and from there was able to get a template for how to plan your RTI program. So this resource is in the resources section on titanium, but it's important that you know what your mission is for your RTI plan. So ours was to ensure that all students receive the support they need in order to successfully access and navigate content. You also need to think of your objectives for the program. Provide support to students based on their levels, increase student achievement in all of these areas, and balance literacy. Increase communication between intervention and general education, collaborate with teachers, support the teachers, and then inform and involve families. So those were our 6 objectives. So our first year of implementation, we wanted to increase the number of students reading on grade level to 50% from where it was at 17%. We actually went up to 54%. So in 1 year, with the model I implemented, we took 17% of students reading on grade level and increased that to 54% reading on grade level, and 70% were on grade level or within 1 level. So our goal for the second year was to have 80% of students reading on grade level and 95% on or within 1 level. So these were some of our more long-term goals to think about. Here was our data collection and evidence. Next, we had the RTI responsibilities here, the persons responsible, the general educator responsibilities, dates for assessments being due. These are the assessments we gave, our target students, the process for targeting students. So lots of good information there with that for you to use as a resource. Other resources for RTI. This book by Mary Howard is published by Heinemann, RTI from All Sides, What Every Teacher Needs to Know. This is a very helpful resource that gives you foundational information of RTI. It's very practical application. I've read this several times. I've spilled water and coffee and all kinds of things on it. A great resource. I'm currently reading this now. It's from our good friends Lipson and Wixon. Hey, they're actually the editors of it, and it's published by the IRA, and it is Successful Approaches to RTI. It actually has more to do with the nuances of RTI and gives you some case studies of schools who've implemented different approaches to RTI. I'm actually doing a book study right now with my RTI specialist, who's one of my direct reports that I manage, and together we're reading this book and doing a book study of it to try and learn some things about sophisticating our model of RTI. So those are some resources for RTI. For you, there are tons of online resources too, the RTI Network, the IRIS Center from Vanderbilt, which we used in Read 516. There's more and more resources coming out. All right, week 7 readings. Again, there are just 2. The first being about making instructional decisions based on data. I really like this one because they give you guiding questions to think about when you, well, first they tell you what 3 types of data you need to look at, and then they give you guiding questions to use when you look at the data, and then they give you a sample of a team that met and followed the process. So it's a very helpful article. And then a short article on how you need to make the most of your assessment data. Again, I'm not a super big fan of this article, but it hopefully will give you some tips. All right, this concludes our session. Hopefully you're more familiar with those guiding principles of response to intervention and are better prepared to create that environment where all students can achieve. Next week we'll talk more about making instructional decisions. However, you will be analyzing data with assignment 3 part 2 and thinking about that. And to launch you, here is a quote from the National Reading Panel that I often use in PD because I think it calls teachers to action. It says, for teacher education to be effective, it must change both teacher and student behavior. So hopefully this information has been helpful to change your behavior as well as student behavior as a result. So have a great week. Believe it or not, we just have a few more weeks until spring break, so hang in there and keep up the great work.